I heard somewhere last night or this morning that because of daylight savings, all the pastors have an extra hour to preach. So, but because I'm feeling so appreciated this morning, I'll spare you, and we'll keep it to the normal sermon length here so we can have communion together. We're starting a new series this month. If you remember, last month we spent time talking about how we can live in the midst of a divisive political season and recognizing the anxiety that many of us feel, and how we can live as Christians and shine light no matter what happens. And then last week we spent time celebrating All Saints Day, and this week we move into talking about a new series which is called How to Talk to People. So you're probably on to us by now that we spent time talking about how can we live in the middle of a political season, and now that season is actually upon us, we're having a series called How to Talk to People, because in response to what happens over the next couple of weeks, we recognize we're going back to work, right? We're going back to the spaces in our community. We have something like Thanksgiving coming up as well, where we spend time with family and loved ones that we may not normally spend time around and that we might normally be nervous to talk to, but then the season that we're in our nation makes us even more nervous to be around. And so we want to examine, how can we live in conflict? How do we handle conflict? How do we talk to people? It sounds so basic, and yet so often we lose our ability to do that. And so that's what we're going to be spending time learning about from our scriptures today. And that's what this is all about. And what we're talking about today in conflict that we're going to learn is just that it's everywhere, it's unavoidable. And oftentimes we think that when we're in the midst of conflict, somebody else started it, but the person that we're in the conflict with says that we started it, and yet we remain in it. Conflict isn't just a one-time event that causes it, we have to remain in it. And the first place that we have to go in order to relieve ourselves of conflict is to recognize that conflict inherently is rooted in selfishness. And the solution to it is humility. I'm known in my family, and sort of the men on my side of the family are known for what we lovingly call in our family passionate discussions. We think arguments is too harsh because they're not arguments, they're passionate discussions. And let me tell you what I mean by that. Because arguments come from a negative space, we enjoy these conversations, whether they're about sports or they're about theology or they're about politics or they're about whatever. We actually enjoy the banter because we recognize the chief goal in the conversations isn't to win or change somebody's mind. It's just to share what we're thinking and share what we're feeling. And we recognize, too, that in those conversations in our family that our love and our relationship for one another supersedes anything that we might disagree upon. And so we're able to hold the disagreements with levity because we're able to recognize what's important. And so what happens is we'll start down one track, and maybe you've had a conversation like this too, even if it's fun or not, where you'll start talking about one thing, and then 10 minutes later, you'll be like, how in the world did we end up here? Because we started here, and now we've made our way all the way down here. And we're able to hold respect in these conversations, and of course we rib and tease each other, but it's all in good fun. There are certain places in terms of friendship and relationship that we just don't go. And these conversations are all in good fun, and yet you probably know of ones in your life that you've had or that you continue to have that are not in jest, that are not light-hearted, that you're not able to maintain a distance between this conversation and our friendship, in our relationship. Maybe it's a short-term disagreement with your spouse or a loved one, or maybe it's a running feud with a coworker or a lost friend or a family member where we so easily forget what we're even fighting about. We just know that we continue to fight. Our relationship is broken, and that's what the fight's about, more than about what actually originated such conflict. Now, either short-term or long-term, it's not about actually finding a resolution. It's actually become about maintaining the conflict and making sure the conflict survives. And we have end goals when it comes to that. And what we're going to challenge ourselves today is to think about what our motivations actually are when it comes to our conflict. Or maybe for you it looks like this: a conversation that starts out by talking about economic policy leads into some really, really dark and personal spaces that it should never head down. Or maybe for you it looks like someone in your family that you know and that you love who you have certain expectations for, and they didn't meet those expectations. They did something that fell short of those expectations that you may be placed on them that they're not even aware exist. And yet they've fallen short, and now conflict abounds, and who knows what the future of the relationship looks like. Nobody wants this to happen, and yet every single one of us experienced this in life in one place or another, and sometimes it hurts enough because it's with people that we care about the most. So what do we do? How do we live in this tension? In the book of James, the author is a faith leader in the early church. He's traditionally understood to be the half-brother of Jesus, and he's leading the early church in Israel. Now, what happens with James is not like some letters where you see from Paul, where he writes to a specific church, like he writes to the church in Corinth, or he writes to the church in Rome. James isn't named after the place it's written to, it's named after James because it's a book of general wisdom of James's theology and James's leadership. And so he's not writing to a specific group, but he's sharing general thoughts and general ideas of what happens in churches. And what we can surmise from James is that leading churches, he put out a lot of fires because he spends a lot of time talking about fires that happen in churches. And so if you often think about how you can wrap your mind around what the church looked like in early church versus what it looked like today, I think James would tell you in a lot of instances it's not that much different. Because people are involved, and when people are involved, things get messy. So in a lot of ways, it's actually much the same. So James sees conflict within the church. James sees conflict happening around the communities because people are not living as Christ with one another or with the world around them. And so he's putting out a lot of fires, so much so that he includes those fires in this letter. And he talks about it in James chapter 4, where he writes this: "What causes fights and quarrels among you? Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You desire, but do not have, so you kill. You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. You do not have because you do not ask God. When you ask, you do not receive because you ask with wrong motives, that you may spend what you get on your pleasures." Isn't it interesting? James says, now remember, he's not writing to a specific place. So when he says, why are you fighting? Let me give you the answer as to why you're fighting. He's not talking about a specific instance of people who are fighting. He's saying, churches everywhere and people everywhere, why are you fighting and where do your quarrels come from? They don't exist in a vacuum. They don't appear out of nowhere. Conflict comes from somewhere. And James has the audacity to say, I can answer my own question. I can tell you where the conflict comes from in all cases. Don't they come from your desires that battle within you? You covet, but you cannot get what you want, so you quarrel and fight. He says, fights have to start somewhere. Conflict has to start somewhere. And James says it's rooted in selfishness. It's rooted in pride. It's rooted in jealousy. It's rooted in anger. It's rooted in gossip. It's rooted in negative talk. It's rooted in self-gain and self-pleasure and self-desire. In fact, the word that he uses when he says desires, and then later he uses the word pleasures, is the last word in this little section that we read. That is the Greek word hedone. And what hedone means is it means pleasure. I think pleasure is the best translation. But there are lots of things. Pleasure has a positive connotation, but hedone has a negative pleasure connotation because it's about selfish desires. It's about sinful pleasures. It's about self-indulgence. Do you see that? So this word hedone is where we get the word hedonism, if you're familiar with that idea. So hedonism meaning you maximize pleasure and you minimize pain regardless of the cost. That's what life is all about. We get the word from that, if that's helpful at all. The Greek goddess of pleasure gets her name from hedone. This is the word that he uses. It's the self-indulgent pleasure. He wants to make it clear that conflict arises and remains when we primarily want our own way, when we are only after what's best for us. We breed conflict with others and within ourselves when we fight only for what we want and make others sit in the back seat. Conflict comes from no other place besides selfish action. Conflict is created because of something that we have done that elevated our selfish desires above our neighbors. We said something we shouldn't have said because we were angry and we needed to lash out. We responded physically to an altercation in which we did not need to because I needed revenge. We said something behind somebody's back because we were frustrated with what they had done and we had to tell somebody else. Whatever it might be that creates conflict, it's rooted in selfish behavior. Whatever the scenario is, we create conflict when we act selfishly. Now, an important place for us to move on from that statement is if you are sitting here thinking about the image in your brain that comes up when we're talking about conflict or somebody that you struggle with or people or a person that you are fighting with, I'm betting when we talk about how conflict comes from selfishness, an immediate thought for you would be, you're darn right, they were so selfish when they did what they did to me. Can you believe what they did? Can you believe it? They were selfish. I can't believe they did that. So, responding to conflict by saying they started it is a childish response that accomplishes nothing. It's so infantile, in fact, we find it in the very first human beings in the Bible. When Eve goes to the tree and she eats of the fruit, who does God catch? Adam. And what does Adam say? She did it first. She did it. He took no responsibility for his own participation in the action. He said, but she did it first. She's really the problem. It's not me. I know I participated in it. I know I did it too, but she did it first. She started it. It's on page 1 of the Bible. Because this is how we respond to conflict. Why? Because we can deflect any responsibility away from ourselves. Because it's safe. But it accomplishes nothing. Again, we double down on conflict because conflict comes from where? Selfish actions. And when we try to blame someone else entirely, we create another selfish action by putting ourselves on a pedestal, putting ourselves on the throne, and throwing somebody else underneath the bus. Because here is the 100% God-honest truth about conflict. It takes 1 to start it and 2 to stay in it. It takes 1 to start it, but 2 to stay in it. Now, this is a very rudimentary way of thinking about this because conflict is complicated. It is inherently complicated. And oftentimes, we are left with what feels like a couple of options. Traditionally, psychologists would tell us when we are met with conflict, we have 2 responses. What are they? Fight or flight. Fight or flight. Now, either fight. Here's the problem with fight. When we get into a conflict, where do our worst decisions come from? They come from our emotions. When we get into a conflict, we become emotionally attached to what's happening. Because something's been done or said to hurt us, we become immediately emotional. Because we are passionate about what we are talking about, we become immediately emotional. And the thing about emotions is that emotions have a way of altering our motivations. Emotions alter our motivations. Because what originally started out as a discussion about what we think the best way to handle a particular parenting situation, or to handle something about our personal relationship, or to handle something at work, has quickly turned into something that has taken on a life of its own because our emotions have gotten wrapped up in it. And what happens when our emotions get wrapped up in it is conflict or conversation turns into fighting. And when we fight, what do we want to do when we fight? We want to win. That becomes our motivation. When our emotions get wrapped up in it, we begin to fight. It's no longer about finding a resolution to what originated the conflict. It becomes about winning. And who are we concerned about when we win? Number 1, we're concerned about ourselves. Our emotions get drawn in, we begin to fight, and when we fight, we want to win. Above all else, and now our motivations have been completely and entirely blurred. Whether it's from our own selfish desire to win or to be right or to get or keep ourselves out of trouble or to maintain our reputation, it is selfishness that's created the conflict. It's selfishness that has taken something that might have been a healthy conversation or a healthy conflict or a healthy disagreement and has brought it to an unhealthy level. So what does James invite us to do then? He begins his conversation with a question by saying, where's your fights come from? Where do your quarrels come from? He invites us to consider our motivations. Consider our own motivations when it comes to our conflict. What do I really, really, really want? In the moment, I may say, I want to win, I want to embarrass them, I want them to hurt in the way that I hurt. And that may be true, but I'll guarantee you it's not the original thing you wanted. It's not the original thing you wanted. The original thing you wanted was forgiveness, right? And now that you haven't gotten it, now you want something else. We need to dig deep within ourselves and within situations to beg the question, what do I really want? And to be brave and bold enough to ask the question to someone else that we are in the conflict with, what do you really want? Tell me what we're after here. And if we can begin to see that, we are no longer concerned with fighting. We're no longer concerned with winning. We are concerned with unity and with relationship and with reconciliation and with progress, which is what we should be after as humans. Every single time, without fail, if we ask the question, what do I really want? We will find that the conflict began probably long before the conflict actually began. You are in a conflict at work with somebody about the best process for accomplishing task A, and then you begin to fight because you can't agree on what that topic is. What's the real problem? The real problem is they took a job that you really wanted, and your relationship can't possibly be the same because you were hurt by not being accepted for that role. And now conflict is easier to enter into because that is baggage that comes in the midst of our conversation. See, the problem is never the problem. We need to dig and dig and dig and find the root. And what does James say the root of all conflict is? Selfishness. Where have I been selfish in the middle of this situation? We can pretty easily recognize where the other person has been selfish in the midst of conflict. And that's important to bring up. But to understand where have I been selfish in the midst of this is where we're going to be able to learn and grow and begin to move toward reconciliation instead of just continued conflict. So what does it take to get there? If we have to find the root of the problem, conflict can be solved with humility. Humility. Not thinking of yourself as less important and not even necessarily backing down from your perspective or what you think is right or what you think is important or standing up for what needs to be done. Humility says, where have I gone wrong in the midst of this discussion? Where have I gone wrong in the middle of this relationship? That we are led to a place now where we're not even being productive. We just continue to fight over and over again. When you consider somebody else more important than yourself and how they are receiving what you are putting out there, you begin to see your conflict differently. Because to consider ourselves more important, to consider others more important than ourselves is simply the way of God. We see this never more prevalently than through the person of Jesus. Jesus showed up, left the comfort of heaven, came to earth into the middle of our conflict, into the middle of our religious fighting, into the middle of conflict between the Jews and the Romans. So he enters conflict personally and nationally, globally certainly, to show us that there's more options than fight or flight. That fight or flight are not our only options when it comes to conflict. Because despite conflict that surrounded Jesus everywhere, Jesus surrendered himself to the point of death, even death on the cross. Jesus responded to the conflicts that we created through humility and self-sacrifice. This is the response of Jesus, and this is the response of conflict. Now, Jesus didn't do that just to make a point. Jesus brought resolution in the middle of his self-sacrifice. So it's not that he ignored the problem. He brought about reconciliation through his actions, but he did it through self-sacrifice. He did it through humility. He did it through grace. He did it through love, because that's how far love and grace are supposed to go. And so the gospel of Jesus that James declares in James chapter 4, what we just read, is if not even death can separate you from love, can separate you from one another, can separate you from God, then what in the world could your neighbor possibly do or possibly say that makes them separated from love? What could you possibly do? What conflict could you possibly have created that makes you unworthy of love, or unable to receive love, or unable to receive grace, if death does not even have the final say in what separates us from one another? Instead, Jesus gave up a lot for a resolution to a problem that we created. And we are filled with his Spirit, his love, and his power, so that we can live out the finished work of Jesus by the way we offer grace to one another, the same grace we've received from Christ first. And now normally as we wind down the sermon, where we try to go is to some sort of application. We've talked about what the Bible says about it, how we can learn from it, how we can look back, but now how do we look forward? Here's the problem to application when you're talking about conflict. I would not recommend you go starting one just to practice doing better with it, right? That's not how we're going to apply the message today. In fact, we're all in the middle of conflict too, and I wouldn't even necessarily recommend that you would say, okay, I heard a sermon about this, let me go practice on this person. I think that does a disservice to your relationships. But what we can do is prepare our hearts and prepare our minds, knowing that it's a part of our relationships, even the people that we love the most. And so we can prepare ourselves to respond, and then we can prepare ourselves potentially to re-engage with a conflict that maybe we've stepped away from, because we don't desire winning, we desire reconciliation. And so here's 3 ideas I want to pass by you that may be able to help you with an alternative to fight or flight. Number 1 is to listen to healthy conversations of people with differing views. Note the word healthy. That doesn't exist on cable news. That doesn't exist probably on national radio. That doesn't exist on social media. You're going to have to find it from someplace else. Like, podcasts are a great resource for that. Again, you still have to be careful. And I think that you all are grown adults who are intelligent enough to spot the difference between healthy conversation and unhealthy conversation. Between conversation where somebody is set up to win and somebody is set up to lose. Conversation where grace is not offered and differing perspectives are not approached at with the same amount of power. So listen to healthy conversations of people with differing views, because the problem is that's become abnormal in our world. That's become different. And instead, what's become normal is unhealthy conversations and unhealthy conflict and one-sided conversations where people are looked at as greater than or lesser than, depending on the lens with which they want to be perceived. So we need to make it normal again to listen to healthy conversations of people with differing viewpoints. So that's number 1. Find a way to do that. Number 2 is ask genuine questions. One of the places that we go in conflict, when we know we're not being humble, is when we don't ask questions. Because we want to be heard and we want our point made and we want to win, we stop asking questions. And not questions that are sarcastic or questions that attempt to throw somebody else under the bus, but authentic and genuine questions that make you say, I really want to know where you're coming from and what has gotten you potentially so riled up about what's happened. Because then maybe that's going to allow us to see something that we've done or something that we've said that maybe played a role in all that. Or maybe we're going to learn about something, man, you know what? I forgot to eat breakfast this morning and I came in kind of hangry today. Well, let's have a snack and let's keep talking. Sometimes it's simple, but if we don't ask genuine questions, we can't get to the root of our conflict. So we need to ask genuine questions. And number 3 is it's a practical technique that you actually can apply going out to tomorrow or today when you experience conflict, and it's called a pause prayer. And the way that I describe this is when conflict shows up, and you probably know the illustration. You can feel the blood pressure. It like starts at your knees and then makes its way up. Do you know what I mean? The anxiety. In cartoons, they have it like, where the cartoon character starts to turn red and then they go all the way up here and then the smoke comes out of their head. Like when you feel that starting, train yourself. It takes time. It takes effort. Train yourself that when that begins to happen, you have an immediate response to stop and to pray. Because if you do that, you will respond differently, I promise you, every single time. If when you feel the anxiety rush through your head, when you feel your blood pressure boiling, if you use that as a trigger to stop and to pray and say, holy, loving God, fill me. Have your way with this situation. You will live and respond to that situation and to the person that you're dealing with completely differently. So that's the pause prayer. We want to listen to healthy conversations of people with differing views. We want to ask genuine questions before a conflict, during a conflict, and after a conflict. And when we're entering into one, can we stop and pray? Those are our 3 tactics for today. Those are what allow us to be humble in the middle of our conversations. And another way that we practice humility is actually found at this table. Because we come to this table